April 1865. The American Civil War had finally drawn to a close, with the Union claiming its ultimate victory. After years of brutal conflict, the bitter struggle had ended, and the Union flag waved proudly once more, a symbol of freedom and reunification. The streets were filled with an ineffable joy, a deep sense of relief and reunion after a long and painful separation. After years of blood and tears, the nation was ready to heal its deep wounds and rebuild its shattered unity. This was not merely a military triumph, but a spiritual cleansing. In the wake of the war's devastation, the hope for a new beginning and a bright future blossomed in the heart of every citizen. Each weary face carried 1,000 stories, and each story served as a poignant reminder of the true value of peace. At the very heart of all this hope, this new beginning, stood the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. With his towering stature and charismatic presence, he was not just a leader, but the conscience of a nation. His wise leadership and unwavering resolve had sustained the nation's spirit even during the darkest days of the Civil War. With a weary but determined face, he was ready to be the architect of a new era, an era of peace. The process of reconstruction would be difficult, but he was firmly committed to his vision of bringing a divided nation together and healing its wounds. For him, this was not just a political matter, but a sacred duty. But even as the winds of peace blew their strongest, a poisonous seed was being sown underground. A sinister plot was being meticulously planned to extinguish the nation's hopes in an instant. At the heart of this conspiracy lay a tragedy that would plunge the entire nation into mourning. The mastermind behind this dark plan was John Wilkes Booth, one of the most famous actors of his time. A fanatical Confederate sympathizer, Booth harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Union even after the victory. He viewed Lincoln's conciliatory stance towards the South as nothing more than a tyrant's shameful mercy. Booth was consumed by rage and vengeance. Booth saw Lincoln as a tyrant and believed that this tyrant had to be eliminated. Driven by this conviction, he began to meticulously plan his murder. This plan was not merely an assassination, but an attempt to ignite the flames of rebellion and reclaim the South's honor. Booth, ironically, chose Ford's Theater, one of Lincoln's favorite places, as the most suitable location to execute his plan. As an actor, he knew every corner of the theater. He knew that the stage lights and the crowd's noise would mask his horrific act. The theater would not just be a place of entertainment for him. It would become a bloody stage. To carry out his plan, Booth had prepared a pocket-sized Derringer pistol and a sharp dagger for close combat. These small but deadly tools were cold, tangible symbols of his quest for revenge. Each time he held them, he felt the hatred that had accumulated within him materialize. His eyes filled with hatred and his ambitious heart were preparing for an act that would change the nation's destiny forever. Each time he looked at Lincoln's portrait, he saw not just a personal enemy, but a figure representing all of the South's suffering. This hatred had dehumanized him and turned him into a murderer. And on April 14th, everything was ready. All plans had been made, all details considered. Booth set off towards the theater with the same determination an actor has when they step onto the stage. The theater where he once performed would now be his final stage. April 14th, 1865, Good Friday. That day was the brightest day of peace and hope. The streets were filled with the warmth of spring after the grim winter, and people illuminated the city with smiles on their faces. No one could have known that this bright day would bear witness to one of history's darkest moments. That morning, Lincoln attended a cabinet meeting to discuss the future of the nation after the Civil War. Enormous issues were on the table, such as healing the war's wounds, reintegrating the South into the Union, and completely abolishing slavery. Despite his weariness, Lincoln was ready to take on these immense tasks. After his official duties that day, he decided to attend a comedy play called Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary Todd. Mary Todd's insistence and Lincoln's need for rest had influenced this decision. It was a long-awaited, ordinary, peaceful evening for them. As the couple rode towards the theater in a carriage, the public greeted him enthusiastically in the streets. The applause and loving cheers were a testament to the nation's profound gratitude for its hero. Lincoln was not just a military leader. He was a leader who had touched the heart of a nation. At the same time, John Wilkes Booth was waiting impatiently outside Ford's Theater. For him, this was the moment to prepare for the most important role of his life. The joy and hope of the crowd could not silence the whispers of the hatred growing within him. Booth was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to play out his dark script. For him, this theater was not just a place of entertainment, but also his final stage. Just like an actor rehearsing a role before stepping onto the stage, Booth was planning his final moment. He was adjusting every step, every breath, for this final act to be performed flawlessly. This was his moment to enter the stage of history. Booth was waiting for the perfect moment to slip into the theater and execute his plan. Like a hunter, he waited patiently for his prey's most vulnerable moment. He distracted the theater staff with brief conversations and silently put the final stage of his plan into motion. Every second brought this historical tragedy one step closer to fruition. And then the moment arrived. That fateful moment when history was shaped by an act of negligence. The guard in front of the president's box, John Frederick Parker, had abandoned his post. Booth, for this, was the golden opportunity he had been waiting for to execute his plan. As his eyes followed Parker's retreating figure, his heart began to pound rapidly. He moved silently towards the box door. Like an actor, he knew how to minimize noise. He wedged a small piece of wood into the door from the outside, ensuring there was no other exit besides his escape route. There was no turning back now. This act was not just about locking a door. It was about sealing his own fate. His plan was to execute his deed at the play's funniest moment, during that critical instant when the audience's laughter would muffle the sound of the gunshot. Just like an actor waiting for the most important line, Booth was biding his time to make his entrance onto the stage of history. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. Backstage, the horse he had prepared for his escape was waiting for him. Booth knew that his escape route was ready after his horrific act. He quickly grabbed the handle of the heavy door, as if he were parting a theater curtain. The cold breath of the devastation he had left behind felt like the harbinger of a victory. The theater was filled with laughter in every corner. The warm and joyous atmosphere of the auditorium reflected the liveliest celebration that came with the end of a war. Everyone was happy and at peace, not with the play on stage, but with Lincoln's presence. His presence was proof that the nation had come back together and was healing. As Lincoln and his wife entered the box, the entire hall rose to their feet. The enthusiastic applause, combined with the standing crowd, created a wave of love. Despite his weariness, Lincoln was deeply moved by this show of affection. For him, it was a leader's greatest reward. This enthusiastic applause was not just the opening of a show, but a testament to the deep love and gratitude the public had for them. Everyone knew what this tall, humble man had done for the nation. He was the symbol of peace and unity. The hall was filled with a shared sense of sorrow and joy brought about by this emotional moment. Lincoln was enjoying the play with his wife and close friends. For the first time in a long time, his face showed a complete sense of peace. With his loved ones by his side, he seemed to have forgotten all the burdens of the war for a moment. This was a rare moment of tranquility for him. At that exact moment, a comical line from an actor on stage plunged the hall into laughter. The laughter that echoed from every corner of the auditorium reflected a nation's joy and heartfelt happiness. The theater had turned into a vibrant sea of laughter. This laughter, almost like a siren, was announcing the approaching danger. This joy was an eerie contrast to the tragedy that would strike in the very next second. As everyone enjoyed the moment, the hand of fate was already preparing to make its final move. Behind the box door, a dark and silent shadow was approaching with a deadly intent. The joy on the stage could not drown out the whispers of hatred growing within this shadow. This shadow, like a monster, was about to make its final move to destroy innocence and peace. That shadow was none other than John Wilkes Booth, the man who would change the course of history. The pocket-sized Derringer pistol he held possessed a destructive power far beyond its small size. Each time he held them, the fire of vengeance in his heart grew hotter. Step by step, Booth was moving toward murder. His fingers were clenched on the cold metal of the pistol. The expression on his face was a mix of fear and madness. This moment would be his final performance on a theater stage, and this performance had only one goal: to eliminate a nation's leader. He gently opened the door. The joy and light inside were a stark contrast to the darkness and horror outside. He saw Abraham Lincoln, surrounded by his family and friends, watching the play in peace. This sight only fueled the hatred within him. He had now stepped onto a path of no return. When the play's funniest moment arrived, the hall was shaking with laughter. Booth seized this opportunity, bringing the Derringer pistol in his hand close to Lincoln's head. Everything would happen in a split second of silence. This was the second that would change the course of history. Even in his final moments, Lincoln was at peace. The smile on his face was a reflection of his faith in his country and the tranquility brought by victory. For him, this was not the end of a dream, but the harbinger of a new beginning. At that very moment, a gunshot echoed, instantly silencing all the laughter. The sound transformed the joyous atmosphere of the theater hall into a nightmare. Smoke and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Mary Todd's scream of horror echoed through the theater. This scream was not just the sound of a personal tragedy, but also the voice of a nation's shattered heart. As everyone tried to figure out what was happening in shock, she was reaching for her husband. Major Rathbone quickly shook off his shock and lunged to stop the attacker. The duty of protecting Lincoln was more important to him than anything else. However, at that moment, he was helpless against Booth's speed and savagery. The echo of the gunshot plunged the theater into terror. The joy was instantly replaced by panic and confusion. People tried to figure out what had happened while the actors and audience on stage were frozen in shock. This was not a joke. This was a tragedy. Mary took her husband's head in her lap. Tears mixed with the pain on her face and streamed down her cheeks. This was the greatest pain a wife could endure in her husband's final moments. She tried to shake him, as if she could bring him back to life. However, Lincoln's eyes were already fixed on the distance. Major Rathbone, who tried to stop the attacker, was suddenly wounded by Booth's dagger. The dagger was not a theater prop for him, but a weapon in every sense of the word. The blood from Rathbone's arm splattered onto the red velvet curtains of the theater, leaving the first tangible mark of this tragedy. Then, like an actor, /S dramatic exit in the final act, Booth leapt onto the stage from the edge of the box. The leg he injured while falling from the box was a small price to pay for his victory. The stage had now become a platform for his final performance. The horrifying screams from Lincoln's box instantly brought the joy in the theater hall to an end. The audience had turned from spectators of a lighthearted comedy into live witnesses of a terrible murder. The actors on stage had forgotten their lines and were frozen in shock. He raised his hand and shouted, /Sic semper tyrannis, which means, thus always to tyrants. These words showed that his act was one of rebellion and vengeance. In that moment, he had transformed from an actor into a terrorist. With a broken leg, he limped as he ran toward the backstage. The chaos and fear he left behind made his escape even more dramatic. This stage, where he was once applauded, had now become an escape route for him. The audience jumped from their seats in a panic, looking for a way out. Fear, which had replaced joy, covered every face. The theater had suddenly turned into a hellish mess. The theater had turned from a hall of laughter into a house of mourning in an instant. The atmosphere of hope and victory outside had been replaced by a nation /S collective grief. No one could have imagined that such a joyous day would have such a tragic end. As the chaos in the theater continued, doctors rushed towards the box. Amidst the chaos, like a beacon of hope, they were focused on saving a life. They checked Lincoln /his pulse and, despite his hopeless condition, were determined to keep him alive. Lincoln, gravely wounded, was carried to the Peterson house, directly across from the theater. His carriers were weary and somber, but they were not leaving their hero alone on his final journey. As they moved silently across the wet cobblestones, the heart of the nation beat with him. In a narrow and dim room, he was waiting out his final hours. Time seemed to have stopped at that moment. The flickering light of the gas lamp cast mournful shadows on the room, /its walls. The atmosphere of the room was filled with the weight of the moment where a leader, /its tragic end, and a nation, /its fate converged. His close circle and doctors stood by his side in his final moments. The silence in the room was only broken by Mary Todd, /its sobs, and the doctors, /sorrowful whispers. Everyone was waiting for one of history, /its greatest leaders to take his last breath. Silence and sorrow enveloped the room, /its atmosphere. This was not just the silence of a room, but the silence of a nation, /its heart. The rain outside accompanied this sadness. Everyone was waiting for this painful end to come. Time, it seemed, had come to a standstill. The ticking of the clocks was like a nation, /its heartbeat. Every moment was a moment of sadness and waiting. Seconds, minutes were as precious as a lifetime, /its final moments. Everyone was wondering when that last breath would come. The next morning, with a mournful sunrise, Lincoln took his last breath. Those in the room were not witnessing the final moment of a leader, but of a father, a husband, and a friend. At 7:22 a.m., a nation, /its heart had stopped. Meanwhile, Booth continued his escape. He was being crushed under the weight of the horror he had left behind as he rode through a dark and rainy forest. He was no longer just a murderer, he was also a fugitive. After a 12-day chase, Booth was cornered in a barn in Virginia. This barn would not be a sanctuary for him. It would be a tomb. During the confrontation, he met his own end. He realized that this act, which he once felt was heroic, was in fact a dagger plunged into a nation, /u 2019's heart. As the one responsible for one of history, /u 2019's greatest tragedies, he brought about his own demise with his own hands. Lincoln, /u 2019's death plunged the entire nation into deep mourning. Millions of Americans mourned as if they had lost a friend, not just a leader. This tragedy was ingrained into the nation, /u 2019's collective conscience. But his legacy, with its vision of uniting a divided nation, continued to live on. Even though Lincoln was physically gone, his ideals became a part of the American spirit. While Lincoln, /u 2019's final act was a dagger to the nation, /u 2019's heart, it proved that his ideals of peace and unity would live on forever. His legacy is not just a stone monument, but the soul of a nation.